What's going on, folks? Welcome back to Bed Boys, your one-stop shop for all your energy drink reviews and performance talks. As always, I'm Christian,
I'm Brian.
and we are the Bed Boys back in the studio again today. Before we get into some topics, obviously we gotta pop some top, then talk some shop. I got a drink that I've had on the show a couple times before, Lime Slush Alani. Not because it's my favorite, but because it is free. So shout out Scuba Steve, our clubhouse manager. He hooks it up. I'm not going to complain about free when it comes to energy drinks. I'm a snob, but I'm not a snob, so I'm going to get this boy cracking.
I got one that was brought to me. This is a cool thing about being an actual energy drink addict is when
Connoisseur.
a connoisseur, one might say, a sommelier of the energy. But what's really cool is, when you see people, they bring you one. They bring you some. And I got to see some friends, specifically our boy Gabe Mason, who has been on the show. And Gabe Mason had previously sent you and I a text message of like, you gotta review this one. And so he brought me a couple cans of the Cherry Berry Lime C4 Smart Energy. So I'm pretty hyped about these. C4 Smart Energy is a little bit different formula than C4 Energy for a lot of people that don't know. It's still 200 milligrams of caffeine, but think of it less as a full-on pre-workout kind of performance energy drink. I don't know why I'm yawning. I can't stop. There we go. But it's got a little bit more nootropics in it. So the nootropics in there specifically are, as I kind of get to it, because there's not necessarily going to be a ton. 200 milligrams of caffeine, of course. We then have the cognizine acetylcholine, not listed in an amount, which is a little tough, but that's okay. Potassium citrate, which of course, green coffee bean extract as the caffeine source. And then you'll kind of see, I think there was one more. Of course, you have your B12s, but then they have like a tyrosine. So is it the best, nootropic formula? Probably not. Does it have more than the average C4? Probably. Is this going to taste good? My hope is yes, I trust Gabe. But
yeah, gotta trust Gabe. Gotta get this guy back on the show too.
Yeah, we do. Because that was a good pop. That's a guy who just knows ball. That's a real ball knower. That's way different than what I was thinking. It's not bad at all. I was thinking almost like a really, like a cherry limeade. Like, you get that real strong flavor. But with like a little bit of berry. Just a hint. It literally tastes like a berry and kind of cherry. Kind of like a right there, and then it just finishes with a little bit of lime. It's very much more heavy on like the berry, which is kind of sick. Wasn't expecting that. Ooh. Shout out Gabriel. Need the boy back on here. But I do believe we have a couple of topics that we wanted to talk about today that we didn't get to on the last episode.
That's right.
If I may be correct.
Yeah, so got a few ones we could dig into here. I'm going to go ahead and start off with when do you change or rotate exercises within, and this could be within your own training and then more broadly applied to the teams and the athletes that you train. Talking about exercise selection. Do you keep them the same for an extended period of time? Are you someone that changes them a little bit more often? Does it depend on the team? And does it vary from, because for me, I feel like it varies a lot.
On location.
For me, like, the location also, and just like me and my like personal training, like how I train myself versus how I would train athletes that I'm working with. And then I think that could kind of roll right into what we want to talk about with like minimum effective dose in training is something I've been thinking about a lot. Certainly not something that we haven't touched on before, but just something that's been a little bit more prevalent for me in my situation recently. So I guess we can start on like a, I'll start off on a, like a personal level, changing exercises. I feel like when I'm lifting, I'm not a person who has trouble sticking, like obviously strength coach, like to train. So it's a little bit, you got to keep that in mind. It's easy for us as coaches to like kind of be throw the hands up and be like, what the hell with athletes. And then we remember that their sport is their sport and not the weight room. And there's a reason that we're strength coaches, which is all good. But I'm someone who I could do these same exercises for a pretty extended period of time and not get super bored of doing them. So I can do that. Oftentimes I feel like I end up switching a little bit more often just to try certain things. And also depending on, especially when you're traveling a lot more, kind of the equipment, the access to the equipment that you have is a little bit different at different places. So, but generally for myself, I feel like I can go like,
8 months.
yeah, I was just gonna say like anywhere from I feel like eight to especially with the main compounds like I'm going like I can go like 8+ weeks, but normally like I like to do something for I would say like bare minimum 4. I used to kind of program in like 4, maybe 5 week blocks, and this was for like myself and my teams. Now I kind of think in a little bit longer terms. I feel like almost 6 to 8 weeks is a little bit better to really like get good at those movements. And maybe, some people out there maybe have your main, movements for upper and lower, and you kind of keep those in year round and just kind of change the accessories. Um, but for my athletes, obviously it's kind of a little bit different now. Depending on the athlete, I have some people that like really just like the same movements and want to keep those in there for like extended periods of time, which is honestly like I'd rather have that than people that try to say like, oh, like I want to change something every like 2 weeks because we know that like, okay, you're not really doing something long enough to get good at and get a good adaptation. So I'd rather do that. And then over time, I gotta be like, hey, let's try to like switch it up a little bit. We've been doing this for 12 weeks. I think we might need to be due for a little switch up. But yeah, that's kind of my general shtick is like I like 6 to 8 weeks. And I think one thing that's kind of helped me is like because a lot of times these athletes don't love to train, or they like to train, but it's not like their main priority. So they get a little bit bored. I think keeping the main movements the same, but then like swapping accessory movements every like 3 to 4 weeks is something that I found that's been like helpful because it's still like novelty, but you're still pushing the needle on your main movers there. So that's kind of my general take. I'm curious to hear yours, especially working with track and field, the sport of training itself.
This is what sucks is you just said my point.
Ah,
we've
sorry.
we spent too much time together and gotten too similar, but like I'll keep my main movements like similar for like 6 to 8 weeks. Whether I'm doing, 3 week blocks in this 6 week block or 2 4. I don't know why I keep yawning. Gotta slam
Because
more
you need an
energy.
energy drink.
I know. But then I change out all the little accessories, And I love, especially in season, our indoor. I typically front squat a lot more indoor, move to a split squat, just to keep things moving a little bit faster, a little bit more support in the back, whatever reasons. But then I'm gonna mess with the plyos. I know that I want 16 to 20 intensive or shock plyometric contacts, and I know that I want to pair that with XYZ. Those are what I'm gonna like swap out based on how they look, where, and I measure a lot of them. So I don't want to keep measuring the same thing and kind of end up chasing that number. Like we've talked about this a ton of times. So maybe I'll switch from a broad jump to a double broad or swap it to like a depth drop vertical or something like that, simply to keep just adjusting and having different variations. But that main movement, I'll pretty much stick on for at least 6 to 8 weeks, like you had mentioned, which is kind of cool because in the sport of track and field, again, like you said, training, and we kind of coincide with like 3 week blocks that learn volume, and then execute slash perform. But it's also, I kind of think about it in like track and field. Your sport is sprinting or hurdling or whatever it is, but you're not swapping that out. Not swapping that out a ton of times. You're just changing how it looks a little bit or what goes with it. So that's where my like reasoning on that is. As far as personal training, what I do, I have been front squatting every Tuesday pretty much for, I might be going on a year now. um
Sick. That's
yeah,
consistency.
like I front squat, you know that's the only way I bilateral squat now. I can't get comfortable with the bar on my back. When it comes to like a bilateral squat, I hate a back squat. um of course my front squat's gotten a lot better and the numbers shotting up, but like I'll split squat, Kate, like I'll throw that in there, have no issue. Reverse lunge, whichever one you want to call it. But vertical press, that's or horizontal press, that's a bench press, man. Yeah, I'll flip it to a Larson press, so I flip my legs out, but that's really it. Like I'm gonna change all the other things that go with it. I want to RDL, but I'm gonna deadlift a little bit, and I want a sumo deadlift because someone else is in the weight room hitting a sumo. Okay, I guess we're gonna sumo today instead. Like for me, a lot of it is keeping the themes in like my own like personal like training time that I get to allocate. And it's like you have to, today's your squat day, today is your hinge, today is your press, this you're sprinting today, whatever it is. And it's like plug and play what feels good for that day, because a lot of the times in our as coaches, we structure so much of our own training. For us, it's like what's fun, what gets me to enjoy it, what do we all want to do as a group. We're not the dungeon rats, but we're the bird's nest. So
Hell yeah.
like great example, Tuesday, everyone kind of looked around, we were like, we're sprinting today, yeah, all right, cool, what are we doing? Are we doing 10 tens? Are we doing 15 tens, 2 plus 5s, whatever it is? And we have enough training in us to not need to go a super short to long. We just know we want to have X amount of sprints. So
Mhm.
thankfully that's kind of nice that we do it enough that we can have that opportunity. But I think that's built up over time. And then we're like, okay, we're gonna jump to, all right, what kind of jump we all gonna do? Something that everyone can compete at. So like the athletic movements are just the flavor of the day. We just know that this is our theme and that's what we're doing. Um, and then like I said, I just kind of default to front squat when I do want a bilateral squat because I find it more comfortable. It's weird, I understand that. Maybe I'm a sadist. I held a ISO for 10 seconds yesterday on max effort. Um, but I think there's a lot of that can be done. I would be really interested to see a a program that maybe a coach is selling, and it's all based off of maybe not in the field work or anything like that when you're doing to be more athletic, but like when it comes to the weight room, it's like everything's a theme. It's not a specific lift. I would be really interested to see how that something like that could sell. Um, and are you writing that down to take that idea?
Yeah, bro. Always, I mean, the student as much as I am the co-host here. Come on now.
But it's like, hey, you have 5 options to do. You're doing one of these 5, or you're, whatever it is. You're squatting bilaterally.
Hmm.
Number one, that person who's probably buying that program then either already is a little bit more refined in training, so they might see some different results, or two, it teaches them a lot more in their training by understanding why they might be picking one versus the other, versus them just going. "Oh." And I think that it could have a ripple effect. Like if it becomes really big, like we look at like a muscle farm, or any of those workouts that used to get we've talked about this 1,000 times. Any of those workouts that used to get posted on social media when you were younger, then we'd follow those and you'd see, oh, they decline bench press. We have to decline bench press. Versus like if they were like, you have to hit a horizontal press. Here's 5 options.
Hmm.
People get less consumed with the thought of this one exercise as a golden pill now to this is a training program that wants me to accumulate or intensify or whatever it is. So yeah, like I think that's like a cool thing to do when it comes to like your personal training. Also, it
Hmm.
provides variability. Like for us, we've been training for how many years? You know,
Yeah,
over a
fucking over a
decade.
decade.
Yeah, I think we're well versed enough to know what we do and don't like. Number one, we know that at this point the method doesn't really matter as much as the principle behind it. Like as long
Hmm.
as both knees bend and your hamstrings touch your calf, you're probably in a pretty good spot. Um, so I think that provides a little bit more fun to it, especially with us when, like I said, if everything's super structured in all of our life, I think there's more fun to having like variability within our own training.
Hmm.
But with a team, I think you're better off squeezing all the juice you can out of something and then moving
Yep.
on. And that's not to say that a strength or a barbell piece is far more important than a plyometric. But if I said, hey, you're going to do a standing three hop on your right leg and a standing three hop on your left leg, and then in 3 weeks, you're going to split squat again, same thing, but instead of a standing three leg hop, you're going to do a standing triple jump. You're still getting intensive single leg contacts. It just looks a little bit different. And I've probably gotten you to kind of learn and do some motor like learning with that. I think that's a valuable aspect.
Yeah, I love that point you made. It's so funny to think back of like, and I still do love like debating about like, oh, what exercises are better for, what thing. Like, I think those are useful exercises and useful debates to be had and do make sense to a certain extent. But it's so funny to like think back of like, oh, like when I first started training, of like, oh, like this exercise is like, what do you hear? What is it like? The king of exercises, like the deadlift, the king of exercise, which like it's like the old argument of like, oh, like if you had one exercise to do, what would you do? Or if you had five exercises to do, or one for each muscle group, which thankfully we live in a world where we don't have to choose, but I still think those can be kind of like
Fun.
cool. Yeah, they can be fun props. But the more, to me at least, the more, like you said, the more you go on, the more you realize that like, okay, it's more so of just like the intent behind it, the environment, the training environment that you have, and like what feels good for you. Like as long as you can push good intensity, whether that's for some people that's going to be a front squat, back squat, safety bar squat, this and that. I like the idea of like themes and just like this is one thing that I kind of you know not to plug team builder, but like I like that you can do like the drop down options within
Yeah.
the like a horizontal push options because like and I think that can be really good. That's like even something that I've done with some of the older guys like I've been working with. It's like, okay, we're in season. It's also dependent on like what we have, but like, okay, what are you going to be able to push the most output with, and feel good and not be like blown up? Okay. Don't be married as much to an exercise. Yeah. As much as like there is still a part of me that thinks like, okay, like this might be a little bit better than this one. If the athlete's going to feel more comfortable with X exercise and that kind of does it for them mentally, who am I to be like, no, actually,
No.
you're wrong? Yeah, I think sometimes you want to just feel smart and then kind of exert your knowledge when sometimes it's almost better to like keep your mouth shut. Like I was listening to a podcast a little while ago with, I want to say it was Jordan Shallow and he was on Vernon Griffith's podcast.
Hmm.
Really good episode and talked about like, oh, like foam rolling and like obviously there's foam rolling's been a big topic of discussion over the years of like, oh, it doesn't do what it says it's supposed to do. It's not breaking up scar tissue, this and that. And it's like, well, if some athlete thinks that foam rolling gets them ready and like that makes them feel like mentally prepared to train, and are you going to go over there and be like, actually what you're doing is stupid and it's not doing what you think you're doing? Like, yeah, that's real good. That's a good way to get started, like to build some buy-in. Maybe you should just let them, unless it's just excessive, like, okay, this guy's rolling out for 2 hours a day and like
Yeah.
He's not taking care of like everything else, kind of like we talked about with like Rooney. You're stepping over dollars to pick up pennies. But if it's okay, if it's just something they're doing for 10, 15 minutes before a lift and that makes them feel ready, who are you to be like, hey, like stop doing that? You know, we all have weird quirks, I'm sure, that like we like to do before training or with anything else in life. Like that maybe they do something, maybe they don't do anything for us at all, but we're still going to do them just because it makes us feel, you know, it's part of our, you know, rituals and weird routines and stuff. Um, so that's something that I feel like I've definitely learned over the years, but especially like within even like the last year, it's just like the the movement doesn't matter like as much as the, you know, just kind of think of like, all right, what stimulus am I trying to elicit, and then work backwards from there. And it's usually not just a one, you know, one option answer. Um, so I do like the optionality part of training. I think that's also good for like, obviously it's a little bit tougher in like a team setting, but like I could see that being a good thing to do for like early off season. Like, all right, you're sending maybe like, especially for like a fall sport, you're sending them home with the program. All right, let's just do horizontal press of choice, squat of choice, and give them three different options. Okay, give them a little bit of autonomy. And I know this makes me think about like the West Side Barbell method of training, where they would literally, obviously, they're doing max effort and dynamic effort work. You're maxing out damn like very, very often, but it's the exercises are rotating so frequently that you're still able to push high intensity, and you're able to like, they're, the big thing for them was like, oh, you're able to like PR very often because it's always a slightly different variation. Um, so that's one way to do it. And I know like talking guys, if you haven't listened to our episode with Connor Rooney, I believe that was episode 106. Really good episode. He's got some really good takes on training, just outside the box thinker. We were talking the other day and he was like, yeah, I like to, he says like early off season, he's like, I like to switch the exercises, like the accessories, like every 2 weeks, like if not every week, just to like really vary it up. Really like you can keep the main movements like the same, but like early off season, people are usually, especially like in baseball, coming off a long season, a little bit burnt out. You just kind of want to make things like super novel and have them try out a lot of things. You're not really looking to like accumulate overload yet, but you're looking to still keep them like moving. Um, so just like even like that's another way to do it, is switching the exercises even like every couple weeks. But there's really not like a wrong way to do it. Obviously, you got places like Westside Barbell that have a lot of like variation like that and are constantly switching things. But we've also seen like, oh, you can do the same thing for, you know, 6 to 8 weeks plus and still garner progress that way.
I think there's something to be said about like what Connor's doing of just varying it every 2 weeks. It A, it keeps it novel. B, it keeps them engaged. And C, I think the biggest thing is it prepares them to see different variations of movement patterns and identify that things are similar. And if you were to change things in season at that point, I've mentioned this a couple of times, like by me varying my program and changing up, like if they're doing an RDL, but I switch it to chains or to bands, like it doesn't freak them out because they just know and have the expectation that this is like we're modifying it. That's all it really is, and they've grown to have this expectation of that's what it is, which is also really nice. I think it makes them more adaptable, and at the end of the day, if part of our job is to make athletes very adaptable to the situation, right? So putting them in relatively minutely stressful situations in a sense to where they have to learn and be engaged with what they're doing for that 45 minutes to an hour. If part of that is to make them more adaptable as athletes or humans and just in general, why would we not? Right. And if it's as simple as moving around a couple accessories or switching what they are, or kind of like just changing minutely what that big lift is. And if you can get 5% on your front squat max, right, for as an example, or I can get 4%, maybe 3% on that. But by changing what things look like or how they perform it, and I only get 3% there, but I become 4% more adaptable by having this versus zero and requiring super great structure. Would you rather go up in two categories, even if it's less, or only go up in one while negating the other? Right. And I understand the chase two rabbits, you only catch, you're not going to catch any. But in this sense, it's not really, that's kind of apples to oranges in that sense.
Hmm.
We're not talking about like a biomotor quality or bioenergetic. This is a still getting the physical preparation aspect to it while having almost in a sense like a physiological cellular change and the quote unquote like psychological aspect to it. I think I would take the latter.
Yeah, I would too. Obviously, like if the sport's powerlifting or like Olympic lifting, where loading the bar is like the main metric KPI
Yeah.
for performance, you take that all day. But we're all working in team sports, and I think the latter is a little bit better. Um, Reminds me of I'm reading the book Strength Deficit by Tim Karen right now, and he kind of talks about like we are very focused like as an industry on concentric strength because that's what's like if you don't move the weight concentrically, if you can't get that, that means you don't get the rep. Like even though we're much stronger eccentrically, and he's like, we need to kind of examine like more than just concentric strength because we're leaving a lot on the table. Your body's a lot more capable of expressing force, or about your body's a lot stronger eccentrically than it is concentrically. We need to look at more things, and it kind of just goes to like a broader point of like, hey, like the weight on the bar isn't always the main KPI because sports are very chaotic, and it's not always the strongest guys who end up being the best or end up being the most resilient. Like how many times, I mean, there's a lot of people that are like the strongest or the best in the weight room that aren't the best on the field, and vice versa. Not and some people might say like, oh, that means like, where does the importance in the weight room lie? And that's we could do a completely whole different episode just on that. But I think if nothing else, it proves a point of like just to look past strictly numbers, weight on the bar. Obviously, that's important, and you want to see that go up over time. But where is it like where are the diminishing returns there after a certain point?
See, that's some I think we've talked about like language matters a ton, right? And if we only call our and to the common person, you'll probably say, "Oh, I'm a strength coach," right? Even though that's not what you want to say, because you're just going to give them. They know that
It'll
misnomer.
make more sense. I have to
Yeah,
spend less time explaining.
yeah. But for us, like when we say like we're a sports performance coach, like it's not just about strength or strength and conditioning. We do speed work, we do agility work, we do just change of direction work. There's performance outputs and performance inputs that go into this. There's propulsion and yielding. It's all of this, right? It's this very large over encompassing aspect to it that the more one dimensional we make ourselves, the more confined we get in what we're capable of doing and providing. And I think that's a big thing where everybody always says, and it's very ambiguous with what I'm about to say, but we always say like we can't always contribute, and I'm directly negating my words from the last episode, so I understand that. We can't always directly contribute to wins or losses, right? Now, in a traditional sense of the squat doesn't improve they're playing, right? I get that. But if we can make a really robust and adaptable athlete, just in general, and how I quantify that, we don't really always have a number because it's really hard to do that. But we can see that change over time. I think you're in a better position. I always make the analogy of we build a really big piece of marble that the skill coach can then carve. The bigger the marble, the the easier it is to make mistakes when you're carving, right? Because you can always just chisel a little bit more away or whatever it may be. So that's our job, is creating that marble. Give them a really big block, and then they can carve. And I think that is where a lot of value relies on the performance coach in order to contribute to wins and losses, right? If you're trying to take, we talk about speed reserve, we talk about this, but if you're taking a kid who's, 5'4", 120 pounds, but he's a wide receiver, that's really tough to turn into a goated wide receiver, right? And I know we can't affect height, no matter how much we have somebody hang from a bar from their hands. We can loosen their discs up. But
We've tried, boys.
even if we say we have a 5'11", 120-pound kid and 5'11", 190-pound, and we both make them the strength go up, we both make the speed go up, they both have verticals go up, etc. Which one's probably going to be, the better player? More than likely, the larger, but more improved athlete will become the better player if the skill acquisition is constant between the two. And I know we cannot account for that. But if all other things are similar, you're going to take the bigger, faster, stronger, more adaptable, robust kid, which
Hmm.
that's our goal is try to get, and our goal is to try to get the 120-pound kid to be 170 or whatever it is. So I think there's a lot of value in the indirect things that you can do as a strength coach, which unfortunately is not a great way to quantify our value in any organization. But being able to do that and having people being bought in on that and being able to communicate it and show it is really good. Um,
Hmm.
I just don't know at this point how to quantify, how to exhibit that other than like, hey, I've had 4 years on this kid and look where they started, look where they are now, you know. But that takes time. That takes
Yeah.
people now leaving jobs.
Yeah. No, it's tough. And like, it's like the exercise training, the exercises we do are kind of like a means to an end. They aren't the means in and of themselves. Like, it's easy to get caught up in, oh, split squat numbers are up, vertical jump numbers are up. And by all means, those things are like, can be meaningful KPIs. Obviously that's going to be different for everybody. But I hate to bring this up that people always say like, oh, there's no squat rack at the 50-yard line, which there isn't. But I think it's sometimes we get really caught up in like, oh, numbers, numbers, numbers in the weight room. When in the end of the day, like the exercise and the training is a means to an end, with that end being, the goal of them being more adaptable, more resilient, as opposed to just the training being the absolute means in and of itself. Unless you're a powerlifter, Olympic weightlifter, bodybuilder, CrossFitter, etc.
Yeah, I would 100% agree, and even to that extent too. Like the we do want the squat numbers to go up, on a power lifter or like a clean number on an Olympic lifter. But at the end of the day, they still have to execute that lift and in a lot of ways overcome a failure when they don't get a make, right? You can be the
Hmm.
strongest Olympic lifter in a training session ever. You get out there in front of the judges and you have a miss and you cannot respond. I still think there's still things that are warranted near it. Now, there's a vastly higher correlation to success if somebody has, a 400 kilo clean and they go out there, they can probably get 350, you know, and be pretty good. But at at that level, there's probably like they're not going for 350. They're going for, 375, 390, 398 on that like
Right.
progression. So I think they still have to have the emotional control, the awareness when they get out on that stage to be able to execute their lift. And if they don't get it, to respond and bounce back. And, everyone's got, I can't remember who it was, but everyone's got a fight plan until you get punched in the mouth.
Mike
Is
Tyson, I think.
that Mike Tyson?
Yeah, or maybe it's
So,
one of those quotes that's just like randomly attributed to him. You know how
yeah,
like
it really
Winston
wasn't.
Churchill has like hella quotes that people are like, oh, I think Churchill said that.
Churchill's
Maybe
just
it's the
sitting there.
same
He's
with,
like, of course I said that. Yes, I say it all
yeah,
the time. I've
yep.
always said that.
It was always me.
But those types of things are very important too, is to be able to respond to the adversity, to be adaptable enough to do that. And I think again that kind of goes back to the aspect of Is your training always this very uber structured, regimented thing, or do you have that variability in it? So athletes have to learn to be adaptable to the training. There's something to be said about that. I It's anecdotal. It's not extremely quantifiable in a lot of metrics, but anecdotally speaking, I train my athletes to be very adaptable. And the past, two out of the three championships I've taken part in, as like a skill coach, I've had to see that. Indoor getting the 2 day meet condensed into one and having to be adaptable and work around those confines. And then outdoor 2 years ago, having crazy thunderstorms that delayed, some of our races 5 hours. And my athletes had to re-warm up 4 or 5 times in order to make sure, because the timing kept getting moved back, and still being able to execute what they needed to, versus a lot of people who have to have the structure. Having the adaptability does play a part, and it's worked out for us because of that. Again, anecdotal, not necessarily very quantifiable in, well, they were X amount of adaptable and were able to do it, but you can see it where they're not freaking out. They're like, okay, just let me know when I should start my next warm up. I'll execute it. How much time do you think I got? All right, cool. I can do this. I'll cut this out. I'll do this. That's prime example A in a sport that is very quantifiable in track and field. It's numbers. We're not dramatically away from PRs. We're PRing because of these changes, and we're just okay of like, okay, we're used to this. This is not something that is shocking the system. This is playing into our strength now, versus other people being like, oh my god, I have to race again in 30 minutes. You've never had a 30-minute break and been asked to run hard again?
Is there ever a time, I don't know how applicable this is in track and field, but where within training you will, as the coach, purposely like insert chaos into the training? I know that I've heard people doing this like in football where like they'll pretend like someone messed up the warm up even if they didn't, just to see kind of how the guys respond. Um
100%.
because I feel like that's something on the surface you can kind of be like, oh, come on, but this is I think we'll probably tackle this topic in another episode, but for coactive model, like part of the psychological aspect of performance, I think is under underutilized and overlooked within the performance coaching space. Not to say that like, I mean, I'm not a sports psychologist by any means, but I do think there's ways that we can train for, the chaos of the sport outside of strictly, sets and reps and performing exercises. There's things you can, especially in the team setting where that type of stuff matters. Um, like I remember I was talking to Nick a while back and he was talking about like, oh, like we had a lot of like stupid penalties last season in football. So he was talking to me about the stuff you guys were doing within the football training just to kind of like some of that attention to detail stuff. And I was like, oh, that's like actually a really good way to like kind of train the psychological kind of collective, because that stuff matters. You can be the most physically dominant team, but if you're weak psychologically,
It's a long road.
yeah. So
Yeah.
what do you do? Track and field, a little bit different.
Uh, I've had them restart over the entire warm up, getting to like one of our last pieces, which was like our plyos. I'm like, this just looked terrible. Do it again. Or I'll have them like, I had one day where I had them essentially do an A skip, I think 13 different times, just to see. And I was like, I already had it going into the day in my head. I'm like, all right, I'm just gonna cut 2 reps off, and we're just gonna work a lot on A skips. And just doing that, I was like, okay, this is what we're gonna do, and just seeing how they respond, and which is really good. I think you saw some people kind of break a little bit and be like, well, who's messing up? Like, let me get on them. And then other people were like, if you just go harder and we do this, he's gonna stop. The other thing that I love doing in a more structured capacity is, on our we'll have skill days where it's like just purely block work, and I'm going to send them through 20, 30, or 40 meter sprints and do it competition style. So all the lanes are filled. The left side's more hurdles, the right side is going to be more just pure sprints. I'm going to send them off together, but I'm going to have interference. So you have to, that I'm rotating people in between the lanes. You're going to go from 1 to 3. You're going to go from, 5 to 4. I'm moving that interference on them. So at some point, you may have to run next to somebody who's hurdling next to you and can keep your progression. You also have to learn to not be inferent, influenced by who's running next to you when you're normally used to running in lane 4 and being in the middle. Now you're on the end. You have to run your own race. And then we're command starting it. So, of course, it's going to be, I'll usually do a 2 whistle command, 1 whistle set, one's go. But I'm going to play music. So now you have to cut through the noise and you have to hear for that voice. So I'm working with some of those things. And it's the nice aspect to that is they're not going to freak out, or I'll hold them in the blocks a super long time, because you never know when you have that, you always know that one
Stand
yard.
up,
Yeah, stand up,
reset.
getting them getting them ready and prepared for those situations that, and I say this to them a lot, is if the first time you experience that is at a meet, I failed you as a coach because I didn't prepare you for that. I want you to be prepared for that. So when it does happen, you can easily respond. That's a big thing that I think is underutilized. And I think it's a little bit of I shouldn't be saying it on a podcast, but it's a little bit of a secret weapon in track and field is situations like that. We've had it in training too, to where we've had to adjust the schedule. During when we had the snowstorm here, we had to adjust the schedule, we had to adjust the training plan, and we had to adjust where we were training to modify that. And people are just like,
Mhm.
okay, well, I just know that I need to bring my spikes, and that's what I need to worry about. Something like that. Those small little changes in those aspects, while in the moment can be very annoying, and you have to be far more creative. But overall, I do think it does have a positive impact. Maybe not physiologically, but like you said, psychologically in this aspect. Maybe I can't get max speed as that point. Well, then I'm going to have to make sure I hit that residual when we go to the meet and we perform. When you're done, you're probably going to hit 2 more reps just in like the warm up area to make sure that we hit this residual. But for right now, we're going to play it and kind of flip the script on it. So I think that does help a ton. And it's paid off in tenfold without always directly having to be in control of it.
Mhm. Yeah, and anyone that's ever ran track, regardless of level, like leading up to the race is like the most nerve wracking part. Once the gun goes off, it's just kind of like a blur.
Let it go.
But
Yeah.
yeah, there's nothing more like it would always be the worst. And like, I didn't even have to come out of blocks hardly ever. But like, even like an 800 or 1500, where it's like you step up to the line and then they tell you to like relax and stand back up. You got to do it all over again. So that's just the stuff that makes your stomach turn over. Like, it's just
It's an
like,
emotional roller coaster.
oh yeah, it's crazy. Especially when you got to do it. Yeah. It's so if the first time you're getting that is in actual competition, you're right. Like, you have an advantage over someone who's, you know, if you've seen it in training, you have an advantage over someone who hasn't.
I think normalized behavior is also a thing that you can manipulate. The the girls that watch another teammate race with me, as soon as I'm away from that athlete, that's when I'm in a panic. I'm like this, I hope this goes right. I want this for them. But when I'm face to face with them, my thing is I obviously I'm in charge of recruiting, so I try to recruit a very similar type of person. But I want to be able to keep them calm and joke around with them. Just keep them, level until they allow themselves, when they get to the race itself, to kind of amp up. I don't want them riding up here for so long that they have to eventually come down and it's a big crash, or we overreach too early and now all of a sudden they're in almost like a panic because of that anxiety arousal curve. I just want to keep you here. I want to keep you level, keep you relaxed and fluid. And then the minute you get there, that's when it can just kind of click. So like the behavior is the same that you're going to get from me at a meet as a practice, where I want to just joke around with you. We'll be talking about other things to kind of relax you. I had one athlete, she's almost like too intelligent for her own good. To where I'm like, you get so anxious because you're thinking about everything in the race right now. I want you to think about like one or two things and then that's it. So I'm going to talk to you. I'm asking her what book she's reading, and she was reading like a physio book, and I'm like, all right, cool. Like, tell me about like the current chapter. But we're trying to find those things for each individual that kind of pulls them back out of it. And I think that's a huge thing to keep them in that kind of relaxed mindset to where they're not in a panic or this extremely anxious mood. And then, I've always told them like, you don't have to think, let me think. I'm paid to think. You're paid to execute. So all I need you to do is that. And then when they leave, that's when I'm like, okay, let me bear this burden of I'm going to be in a panic now that I hope I train them right.
Hmm. Yeah, I see that too. Like baseball, especially, like it's a big into numbers and analytics. So you get that whether the athlete is that type of person to begin with or not. I think they learn to, for
Become that
better or for
person.
worse. Yeah, for better or for worse, they learn to like value that stuff. So there's a lot of that even like in like during the game. So like I'm usually not like I kind of like to. I'm not like asking about that stuff like during the game unless it's someone who's like not playing. And like I feel like you said, you kind of have to give them a little bit of like the opposite side. Like if they're over here super worried about like performance, you might be better suited to talk about something completely unrelated. And that's kind of what I found too, is like to kind of get their mind off it, relax a little bit. Especially like, I mean, track as much as baseball, it's a long season. Like you guys have essentially three separate seasons. Baseball just has one really long one. So in order to like keep your sanity during that long of a period of time, I think it's important to be able
Have other
to
things.
balance out. Yeah, if you're just running on gear 10 the whole time, it's going to be a long season.
That's what's kind of neat. I think, this is something I've been thinking about lately is that baseball is probably the most similar field sport to track and field in this sense. Physiologically, we compare a lot of like football to track and field,
Mhm.
high speeds, that kind of deal. But like we look at baseball, it's high speeds, there's a very long season, and it's almost overly analytical. In football, you're not a lot of times, like unless you have like one kid who's like, how many rushing yards do I have? You're not keeping track of statistics mid game. You're not over analyzing the throw mechanics of what this felt like or what happened because you threw 93 versus 97 on a fastball. You're not going back and going like, what went wrong? You do that in baseball. That happens to where you're getting these like almost data heavy and technical heavy conversations during this competition. A lot like this can happen, and you're almost like
Mhm.
combating that in a sense. And there's enough space in between the bouts. You run. It's the same thing as if you're going to pitch for 4 innings, but inning two, bottom of the second, the other teams, they're having a good run at it, and they're able to kind of keep things going in that sense. You know, that pitcher's able to think and what went right, what went wrong of that first inning. How do I prepare for the second? They're rewarming
Mhm.
up a little bit. They're getting ready and they're getting prepared, and you have to manage that. You can't. That doesn't always happen in football.
Yeah, it's a little bit more, and I'm sure like especially high level football is getting a lot more into like the advanced analytics, just kind of like the NBA had their kind of like time where they looked more into like the advanced stats. But it's a little bit different with like baseball. It's a little bit slower pace. Like the game duration is a little bit longer, and
Yeah,
there's not a lot of there's not a lot of two-way players. There's not a lot of guys that pitch and hit. Obviously, they're like your Shohei Otanis, but those guys are
few and far
few and
between.
far between in today's game, especially at a high level. Obviously, like in high school, college, it's a lot more common. But if you're a pitcher, like one, especially like in our setting, like if we are playing a Tuesday through Sunday and you're starting on Friday, one, you have 3 days to just kind of watch the game and see like the guys you're going to face. So you kind of have a game plan, and even like within the game, you like like okay, like this is what I threw to this guy last time. And he freaking parked me, so maybe don't throw him that again. Or like, okay, I'm gonna attack this guy a little bit different because you have all these numbers, which can be a blessing and a curse.
Yeah.
But yeah, and for hitters too, like you can be like, hey, like we've seen this guy earlier in the year. We saw him even earlier this week. If he was a reliever, he likes to throw. We have what they like to throw to lefties versus righties, and they can kind of take that. Some guys want a lot of information, and some guys don't really want a lot of information. I think it just kind of depends on like what type of athlete you're dealing with. Some guys like to go out there just kind of like black out and play. Some guys like to have a lot more like analytical approach. So, and I'm not wanting to say that one is better than the other. So,
Yeah, it's tough. And I think it's something that you kind of end up having to learn to manage, especially as like the sport coach, like in baseball. Now in football, like you said, you'll get off the drive, whether successful or failure. They'll probably look at a couple plays that are pulled up on the iPad, diagnose it, what went right, where you should, if you see it again, this is what you should do. But I think there's, like you said, it's a little slower paced, whereas like football, a change of momentum can happen like that. An interception, a fumble, or whatever it is, or like a touchdown. You're back up, so you can't sit there and dwell too long on some of these things. Whereas like baseball, there's almost like a slight allotted of time because of the pitch count and how often it takes to do this. You're guaranteed X amount of time at the very least.
mhm.
They have to get three outs. Um, so in that, it's almost like there's this built-in structure of like do some analytical work on this aspect, which for good or bad, like hopefully like you have some of the people who don't go too far and don't, and you have some that are willing to go from, just wanting to black out to seeing like, okay, like, let's just take a break real quick and look at this. But I think overall, like you're analyzing some of the performance midway through this competition, which is, it's not always going to be a thing. Like it's usually like a lot of times in football, like I said, you'll look at like maybe one or two plays on that drive, and you'll kind of like it's a verbal thing of, hey, did you not see the corner who was kind of like baiting you by laying off on the flat? They wanted you to throw that, versus like in baseball, they might actually be looking at where they threw in the strike zone versus where they normally throw. Things like that can, I'm not saying everybody does that, but those can happen. Same way if you watch a hurdle race and they're like, yeah, I felt like on hurdle 4, I got too close and that's what made my heel clip it, which then messed up and I'm like looking at the video like, okay, so for the next one, like we need to emphasize like how much do we need to clear or where can we wrap the leg, something like that. And even in like soccer, they're a little bit, even when they're on the sideline, they're still kind of like into the game and like seeing and observing, it's such a weird aspect that I think baseball and track and field share that commonality. As different as they are, they're very similar from like a 10,000 foot view, which is kind of neat when you think about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought of it like that. I just thought of it obviously like the season in baseball is, I would say it's the longest out of any sport, and then track in a way is very long just because you have depending on if it's you got 2 to 3 seasons throughout the year, and
Yeah,
there's really only like a little bit of like extended off season period between those periods. So you're kind of always going. So
100%.
what do you think? Want to tackle one more topic, or want to wrap this bad boy up?
What do you want to do?
Let's talk a little bit about minimum effective dose. This is something in training. Got to better specify there in training. So what's the so when we talk about minimum effective dose, we're essentially looking at like what is the least amount you can do in training to elicit an adaptation, and that would be like the opposite of that would be like a maximum recoverable volume. What's the most you can do without essentially like breaking? And I think oftentimes most people's programs tend to fall in the middle of that. This is something that's kind of been on my mind, obviously, because like we just said, long season. And in baseball, it's important to train in season because it's the longest uninterrupted like training block that we have the whole year. So honestly, I would argue that it's the most important because, it's the longest amount of time we're going to have our guys. But obviously, we're playing damn near every day. Performance is also important. So it's like, what is the minimum you can do to still make progress in season? And I think oftentimes, especially as performance coaches, we want to think that there's like an exact number, like, oh, it's this many sets and reps to get that like minimum. And then if I just do that, I'll be perfect. When in reality, it's probably a little bit more complicated and context specific, like than that. But what are your thoughts on like minimum effective dose? Because I think oftentimes like you can get caught up in wanting to progress things when oftentimes just keeping them, you know, very, very similar and not trying to add a lot of volume and keeping just worried about intensity can be the way to go when it comes to in season training.
Minimum effective dose is such a funny concept to me for two reasons. Number one, because it's you kind of look at it and go, a lot of times it's confused with how little can I just do to not be not doing anything versus what's the minimum what's the minimum that is necessary because all the other constraints are so voluminous that I can still make a progression out of this. The other thing is I don't know if there's a strict number. I think it's very relative to the team and the individual, which is it only makes it more difficult. You might
Hmm.
be trying to do minimum effective dose, and you might be in the quote unquote like a max adaptive volume, depending on that individual. That's what's so tough. Um, One of our runners in sprinting, in that terms, and like maybe less about like weight room work. She was on a minimal effective dose, quote unquote, from like a foot injury. So it became, hey, I need to hit at least 10 meters when we sprint of max speed in order to adjust that. And as I saw that we could hit 100 to 120 meters of volume, it was like, okay, that kind of like sets a new basis of what was the upper end of our range is now probably the lower end, and that had to be adjusted and slowly build that up over time. So it's such a weird thing, and I think you won't have those numbers via statistics um, right away. I think you can get them probably over a 4 to 6 week period and understanding that athlete and how they adapt. And then you've kind of set your baseline of like what is enough, what isn't enough based off of if you're using GPS or if you're using just outputs or if you have like visual cues, via the coaching eye of where do they start to break down and at what rep and how much distance was that kind of input. You almost have to run your own quasi research study on your team and your athletes to find that out, which is such a difficult and pain in the ass thing to say. Everyone's going to want a black and white answer, and that is like the one thing that you're like, it's not. A needs analysis will give you the average amongst the entirety of the sport, but having you might recruit high volume kids, so their minimal effective dose is super, super high. Or you might recruit a feed the cats kid who's like, I've never touched over 200 meters in a session. You know, those two are vastly different. And it's like, how do you work with that? So I think like watching and learning from them is just as important to find out that minimal effective dose versus max adaptable volume. Um, Now, saying that, now I kind of look at like minimal effective dose is like probably 220 to 240 on like our max velocity sessions. I'm probably somewhere around 100 meters in an A cell session. Is like the minimal effective dose. And then max recoverable volume, I can get upwards of 500 on a max V session in meters and probably 350, maybe close to 400 if it's weighted on an A cell session, but then you get into speed endurance because you're not touching as much, max speed. I've our, our 100, 200 girls, I try to get them to around 650 as like that peak volume that they'll touch throughout that season, which that can be a lot. Um, But our 800, our 400 hurdle crew, like they'll touch, they can get upwards of 800, 1,000 in high speed distance, quote unquote. That high 16 to 18 miles per hour. Do I get nervous when I do that? Hell yeah. Like, do not get me wrong. That's probably, if I get them near 1,000, that's probably that's max recoverable. Like, and that's not like we're going to recover and be able to sprint tomorrow. That's like I can get you back in tomorrow and you won't be broken. Um, the outputs are not going to be there the next day, but I've grown to find that that's what typically works, and then even the 400 to 400 hurdle crew, like that's vastly different too, because it's you think of like just, time constraints. A good 400 runner is going to be, 54 seconds, but you got to add 4 seconds or 3.5 for that hurdle differential. And that's a lot more energy going into it. So if we're just doing flat out speed endurance or even just like a hill work or repeat volumes, you're adding 100 to 150 just right there. So it's really tough. And then inside the weight room, I think it's really like the event specificity plays a big role. I think it plays a bigger role in their volumes on certain exercises, much more than what exercises they need. That's the way I kind of look at it. Like most of the girls in the alactic portion of track and field on our team, not necessarily like the throwers. I think those are very different. So like they don't do as many plyos. I've said this before, but like they're the one group that does Olympic lifts in our program. But like my triple and long jumpers and high jumpers aren't going to do as many plyometrics in the weight room as the sprinters will, because they just did an hour and a half of those. So I'm going to pull back. I want the more of that minimal effective dose, maybe the 8 to 10 contacts, whereas the sprinters are going to be 16 to 24 on that aspect. But the sprinters get a lot more strength work, maybe in their sleds and etc. So maybe I might pull a set off of them or have them hit doubles versus triples on that strength work. So I think that's where it is. It's like that's the differences. And then I've kind of changed a little bit of thinking too, which maybe this isn't necessarily on max adaptable, max recoverable, and minimum effective dose, but I've added almost like buy-in work that is a little bit more directed, which I think can be partially attributed to max adaptable and recoverable volume, but they'll have specific exercises strictly as like prehab. Um, and that's where I kind of,
Isolation type
yeah, more
exercises.
isolation work. Sprinters typically get hip flexion and hip extension work, whether that be um, on the GHR, hitting, you know, single leg GHRs just for hip flexion work. And all of the exercises that they get in their like buy-in pre coming into the weight room is strictly built in ranges, which I like. I need you to hit at least one set of 8 each side on this to know that if you touch this every single time, we're at least microdosing it. But if we're good, I want you to work up in the upper range, 3 sets of 6. But it's all ranges on that aspect, which is really nice. And it's adaptable to that athlete. Oh, I feel like crap today. All right, let's hit one set. Let's just make sure we get that. All right, I'm feeling good. All right, let's go for it. Let's hit that work. I think that's been a huge game player in the individual progressions based off of that MEV, MRV, MAV, or MED, whatever we want to classify it as. That's going to have more play to it than some of the bigger blocks that you kind of get to a point of, I know like you're feeling like shit, but right now you have to hit this no matter what. And I think a transparent conversation is very good for athletes to be able to be like, I know you feel like shit, but you got to hit this because this is our shot, And I think that's usually the conversation that happens in early March, late February. We have about 3 to 4 weeks where if they don't make nationals, you got some time to train them, and they're kind of beat up a little bit, but you're going, okay, if I'm gonna be able to poke at some strength seriously, like this is the one time. And I think those conversations are really help because your MAV and your MRV go up during that period because they don't have stress of competitions. So your minimal effective dose almost becomes what you were in that I hate this word, but I'm going to say it, like the optimal adaptable volume, that becomes your minimum effective dose now. So that, and those things, like, they just shift throughout the season. Like, it's not always going to be like, I need to be able to hit this no matter what. It's like, well, we look at like a meet schedule, and I hate to, but one day or one meet, you might be running indoor, you're running a 60 and a 4x4. So you have 460 meters of volume of intensive sprinting, not including your warm ups. Another day, you're going to be doing a 60 200. So that drops to 260, or if they have a final, maybe, 320. And then a conference meet, they might be a game changer for you. So they might be running rounds, and they have to run 260s, 200s, and they're running a 4x4. Well, are you not going to do that? I hate this. You don't want to always like put this out there, but it's like a lot of the times you don't want and I'm saying this from the sport coach perspective at this point, not the strength coach, but you're not going to not run your best kid because you're like, oh, well, they hit 400 meters volume. You're like, well, I want to win. And they look like they're capable and they want to do it. They're going to go do it. So is it better to prepare them for that and have some of those other meets be easier? Or is it better to just be like, nope, they just can't do that?
Mm.
So I think you're better off adjusting the training and those volumes to match what the competition kind of demands, in a sense of not just your average competition, but like, what is your highest? That's probably pretty close to like your max recoverable, because you're going to rest
Mm.
them after that.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool side note off that. I feel like one of the cool things of track and field is like the competitions can actually be used as training versus like we think about like training for like football or really any other team sport. Like the big thing is like preparing them for practice, because practice is going to probably be a bigger
Way harder.
stressor than the game itself, versus like you can use. I mean, how many times have you had people, like I remember our coach would have people run events that like definitely weren't their best event, or they weren't going to run those events at conference, but like, all right, you'll be able to build some fitness because you're in a competition setting. I know like your main thing is going to be, one of our, I remember had a teammate ended up being a national champ in the 10K, and like he would have, especially like indoor, you might have him run like an 800 for, it's like, all right, build some fitness, or run, he would run the 15 pretty normally anyway, or the mile in indoor, but like, all right, let's run. And he would still run like one of the better 800 times on the team, just because he was friggin' dog. But that's what I think is kind of cool, is you can use that for, because obviously it's a little bit different. Like not every meet holds the same amount of importance as
Mm-hmm.
far as performance goes. Like you're really trying to quote unquote peak for, conference and qualifying meets, stuff like that. So,
I completely agree. The crazy thing is um, what's so odd about it, not just that you can use competition for training, which I believe me, I do, especially in indoor. We don't have an indoor facility. So there's a lot of times where I'm like, I'm not worried about this meet. You're going to run an off race, but then we're going to take advantage of that training facility while we're there. And I'm going to have you run a good workout. Um,
mm,
or I'm going to add a race that you don't normally run just to get more high speed distance. I'm going to build that into the plan. But this kind of goes back to like I mentioned, like some of the different successors that have helped attribute. But I think approaching track and field less like a track and field coach and more as a sports performance coach, or someone who works with field or court sports in the chaos model, I think that has helped become a different lane to do that. There's so much that sports performance and even other sports steal from track and field in terms of training methods, modalities, ideas, philosophies in order to accomplish their goals, that track and field kind of gets on its high horse of, well, you all steal from us, we must be the golden goose. And to some extent, like there's a lot of the you know, I've met a lot of coaches, thankfully and partially unthankfully, that they think that they know it all, when it becomes, well, you're just going to run that rep and we're going to get better. It's like, there can be so much stuff that you're missing because that's all you're concerned about. and learning from the
Yeah.
other sports makes you a better coach to do that. I think that I thought about this the other day, especially after you and I had talked in our last episode, with me talking about like going to the national convention. Is there was a lot of track coaches who do some of the strength training, and it becomes very secondary to them. And I'm not saying it's more important than the sport, but I think approaching the situation from my perspective has helped a lot more of approaching being a track coach and you know getting more and more and more developed in the skill side, but understanding all of the other big picture stuff that goes into play in the background, from more sports performance stepping into track and field than from stepping from track and field into sports performance. On paper they look so similar. Hey, you're a track coach that does the lifting and stuff as well, but because they're coming from two different angles, they're vastly different in the thought process. They're vastly different in the understanding of the metrics and relying on what you need to, that they're so dissimilar while being alike. And it leads to two different results. And
Hmm.
this isn't to sit there and toot my horn, but I think if there was more of that blueprint to start in one area and transition to the other, it is honestly, I think, a little bit easier to have a ton of background knowledge and physiological stress, etc., and the four coactive model, and then build the skill portion, than to go vice versa. And I don't think it's just because saying track and field skill acquisition is easier. I think there's so many other factors that contribute to that kind of thing, of team management, roster management, budgetary confinements, recruiting. Like, you have so much other stuff to worry about once you get into that world, that coming back is a little bit more difficult. So I don't want to fault the coaches for that, but it is harder to do versus like your entire quest for knowledge is simply on training and adaptability and bioenergetics and physics, all of that. It's easier to add in, okay, let's learn recruiting now and piece by piece that, or whatever it might be, versus like once that's already on your plate, the knowledge isn't as hard to attain, but it's way harder to manage and do those things on a daily basis and then step back. So I think a little bit more of kind of the path I was lucky enough to kind of walk on, that would put more people in a successful position.
Oh, I love that. Start general. You can always get more specific from there, but it's tough to go back and garner that general knowledge after you've pigeonholed yourself into some in a really small niche. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah, dude, that was great. I'll I'll end us with this because I think it's important. Like you said, like people think that just because they run the rep, they get better. And I think like it reminds me of a concept called the concept of entropy. It's basically, I think it comes from physics essentially. It's basically like says that things will naturally go from a more ordered state to a more disordered state. Like things are naturally, and this is like just with literally everything in life is like things will degrade and deteriorate over time if they're not tended to. And I feel like that's like we can draw parallels to that in performance and coaching, like development and improved performance, whether and improved knowledge for like the coach. That isn't just automatic. And the more you do it, the harder it is, just like anything training. Like the harder you train, the longer you train, the harder it is to get more out of your training. So so I think it's important is like entropy for all of us is the default state. And it's your job to fight that uphill battle against it, whether it be as a coach, attaining more knowledge and wisdom, or for your athletes. Like just because they do the rep of an exercise doesn't mean they get better. So I thought that was a good, that made me think of that when you say like some people just think you do X thing and get X result. Not that easy, not that simple.
I think you're 100% right. There's so much, we even just talk about law of diminishing gain or slope of improvement. Like, you have to fight harder and harder and harder to get a little bit less as time goes on. And that's even,
Hmm.
like you mentioned, like on the quest for knowledge, at a certain point, you've read so many books that a lot of them start to seem similar. Even just learning periodization models, you step out after you've learned 10, at 1,000 foot view, and they all look pretty fucking linear. you know, um, Now on a smaller scale, you see the ups, the downs, whatever it is, but it's pretty linear. They're all broken off of that. When I first learned that, it pissed me off. And I was like, that is not true. And as time went on, I started to look out and I'm like, wow, that's pretty linear. Um, but yeah, I couldn't agree more that you're fighting tooth and nail to get smaller and smaller gains. And if you ever think that the only thing that doesn't work like that is money, that's
Yeah,
the
that's
only
true. Compound
thing.
interest, the eighth wonder of the world.
But here's the hard part: raw numbers probably way easier
Hmm.
percentage wise. That probably has the entropy effect.
Hmm.
You might be making 2%, but if you're making 2% on 2 million, you're probably making more in dollary dues on that than you are at 10% at $1,000.
100%.
But that percentage is still relatively going down. The secondary effects of that is just better for you and your bank account. Um, but yeah, I just there's so much stuff like that, and I think you see it a lot. We always talk about like the older coaches of you have 20 years of experience, you have 1 year of experience 20 times. Shout out Kieran Wenham Flat for that quote. I love that one. But I think having a good circle around you that really encourages the growth aspect and learning, and people that keep you on your toes, I think that's very important. You and I talk about so much of the continuing education and having people in your circle that push you, that kind of like reawaken some of these things that may be docile. That's very important. But I think you have to have that in yourself, and that's when someone can utilize the imposter syndrome and weaponize it, like we've mentioned time and time again on our podcast, in order to continue to grow. And I think you can be. I think I'm eight years into this. It feels like forever, but even then, that's still such a short amount of time, and there's still so much to learn. And just having the ability to like step back and be like, I'm still an idiot.
Hmm.
You might
Oh
think you
yeah.
have the answers until you encounter something new, and you won't encounter something new until it happens. So it's really cool to kind of have that learning experience and to have the wherewithal to kind of take a step back and understand like that's what this is right now. This is I'm gonna get to learn and get excited about it, which is kind of cool. Um, but fighting entropy on that aspect, like you mentioned, even if it's just training, it's like you're not going to have a one-to-one direct correlation. Even the same, training ages each other, but they're different. One might be a hyper responder. This kid might have myostatin inhibitors just in their body without them knowing. They're going to respond way more to a non-responder, you know, vice versa on different training effects as well. So
Hmm.
much of that can be just up for debate. So it's like you got to figure things out, and that's what's cool about our job is like the entirety of it. As much as we kind of make the spectrum jokes, like there's a lot of it on us, especially you and I. Like we love puzzles, man. We love puzzles, and that's our job. Is just hey, solve this puzzle, solve this riddle,
Hmm.
and I think like there's a lot to it to be able to do that. And when you find enjoyment in just like I get the next puzzle, life gets easier.
Yeah, man. Man, you're getting me fired up. Yeah. Yeah, you're getting me fired up right now. Yeah.
Didn't mean to go
Yep.
coach speak on you and get the force up,
No.
but
Yeah, get the fours up. No, that's good shit. Yeah. No, remember, folks, entropy is the default. It's your job to fight that uphill battle, whether it be learning, training yourself, training athletes. That's entropy is the default. So fight that uphill battle. So
100%. Let me get off my high horse because I was on a soapbox and I almost fell off. So
yeah, let's get a rating on this bad boy.
let me take a step down here back to reality. That's right. You are 5'8". The soapbox was as tall as you. Um, Cherry berry lime. I like this flavor way more than at first. You look at the can, you're like this blue to kind of like red, and there's white on it. Your first thought is rocket pop, and now reading the name on it does make me think, hey, that's the three kind of like flavors on a rocket pop. Cherry, the white is like a lemon lime, the blue is, of course, the berry. It doesn't taste like a rocket pop. And as somebody who on our show, we have kind of been like, I think Rocket Pop's a little phased out. Like it's overdone. It's one of those things. Everybody's it's like an asshole. Everyone's got one, but I don't need to see it. Um, Seeing the name Cherry Berry Lime instead flipped the switch. So C4 Cellucor, I want to say fantastic job on that because I was far more excited to try this reading the name of the flavors versus Rocket Pop. Um, it doesn't taste like that either. It is a like a you know a cherry berry kind of like almost not a fruit punch, but like that. Like if you were to eat a candy and it was like, hey, it's berry blast, that like ambiguous, like, ooh, this is like sweet kind of berry, and then it finishes with like a hint of like citrusy, like not limeade, but like if you were gonna eat like a lime skittle. So it was really
Mm,
good. So I'm a big fan of the flavor. 200 milligrams caffeine. I would have liked to seen like the actual number of acetylcholine, like the actual percentage that's in there or the actual micrograms that's in there. That would be really cool. Um, I don't know if I had the focus. I feel like I was a little bit more focused on the show, so that was cool. Price point, I think they're selling at like 279 depending on the place. I will have you know this was purchased at a Dollar Tree by Gabe when he got it for me. So that is a huge plus. That if you want a good energy drink, you can go to Dollar Tree. They have 3D as well. So Dollar Tree being sneaky good on getting energy drinks, especially for cheap. Coaches, maybe we got to start finding some Dollar Trees. You take all those factors. I didn't pay, so it was free. Thank goodness. I have great friends who take pity on me. But you take all that into consideration. This is a good drink, really good drink. And for that, I'm going 7-2.
nice. Yep. Already reviewed the lime slush. Again, free. Shout out Scuba Steve.
Scuba Steve!
Yeah. Well, as always, folks, really appreciate you guys tuning in to the show, whether it's on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast. Subscribe, leave a review on whatever platform you are listening to. Really helps us get into the algorithm more. Support the show. BevBoys.com if you want to support the boys with some merch. BevBoys.tv on Instagram, past, future, present episodes, clips of there. And then our personal Instagrams are always associated with those posts if you want to check out some training footage. Yeah, we will see you guys in the next episode. Peace.
Peace.